Before getting into today's stories, let me know where everyone is from and what time so we can send wishes of health and luck to you and your relatives and friends. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos of our channel. Thank you very much, everyone. Let's get started. Story 1. It was late fall in 2023, and the isolated mountains of Northern California seemed to exude a strange, unsettling energy. Sergeant Ryan and his team were assigned to a remote outpost nestled at the edge of Crater Valley, a place so off the beaten path that even the most seasoned mapmakers seemed to forget its existence. They had been briefed on the valley's dark history, a valley of lost soldiers, ghost stories, and whispers of a curse that hung over the land like a shroud. Ryan had been through many tough situations, but nothing prepared him for what came next. The storm hit without warning, an unnatural fury that ripped through their camp and left them scrambling to secure their gear and equipment. By the time the winds finally calmed, a thick fog descended on the valley, so dense and impenetrable that it felt like a physical presence. The kind of fog that made every footstep feel like it was on the edge of a precipice, where the air was so heavy it almost felt like it was suffocating them. For days the fog remained. Ryan and his team had grown used to the silence, the stillness that seemed to permeate the air, but it was the silence of a predator waiting. Their sophisticated surveillance equipment was useless. The night vision, the infrared scopes, even their radios, they all failed in the face of this unnatural mist. The only thing they had left was their ears. They could hear the sounds of their own breaths, the soft crunch of boots on the dirt, but nothing else. No wind, no animals, no distant chatter from the forward operating base. Just the endless quiet and the sense that they were being watched. Every night they heard things in the fog. The first night it was a low hum, so faint it could have been the wind. Or so Ryan convinced himself. But then came the voices, soft at first, like whispers from just beyond the edge of hearing. No one on the team would admit to hearing them at first, but Ryan knew what he heard. The whispers seemed to come in bursts like a chant, a rhythm of sorts. It was too precise, too deliberate to be the wind, too familiar to be ignored. The second night, it was different. The whispers had turned into clear words, though the language was alien to them. They weren't just whispers anymore. They were voices calling out, and not just any voices. They spoke their names. Ryan's name, repeated over and over, as though someone was standing directly in front of him. But when he turned to face the fog, there was nothing. By the third night, it was no longer a question of whether something was out there. It was the how. How could something so unnatural exist in a place so isolated? The fog had become a living thing, curling around their tents like fingers. Probing, testing, they had heard the radio call, desperate, frantic, and had responded with the necessary force, launching a barrage of mortar rounds into the valley below. But even as the rounds exploded in the distance, lighting up the night with eerie, unnatural flames, something in Ryan's gut told him that they weren't fighting against anything that could be killed by a weapon. And that night, when the radio crackled to life again, it wasn't a call for help. It was a different voice, a calm, detached voice, almost as if someone had already accepted their fate. "You did it," the voice said. "You stopped her." Ryan's heart froze. He could feel the weight of the words in the air, as if they were being pressed against his chest. What did it mean to stop her? What had they stopped? He demanded answers, but the voice on the radio only repeated, "You stopped her. She is gone." The voice gave him no more details, no more context, just those words and then a chilling silence. Ryan and his team looked at each other, confusion and fear etched across their faces. They weren't sure if they were supposed to feel relief or dread. The next morning, the fog was gone. The valley was still. For the first time in days, the air felt lighter. But Ryan couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. As they prepared to leave the site, the others seemed eager to move on, to forget the strange events that had occurred. But Ryan remained behind, standing at the edge of the clearing where the fog had once been, his eyes scanning the mountains that loomed in the distance. There was a restlessness in him, a nagging sense that they hadn't truly escaped the fog, that it was still out there, waiting. As the days passed, Ryan tried to convince himself that it was all in his head. The whispers, the radio transmission, the strange figure he thought he saw in the mist. It was all just a byproduct of the isolation, the fear, the exhaustion. But when he returned to base, things took a darker turn. Late one night, after everyone had gone to bed, Ryan was alone in the barracks, staring at the ceiling. The room was silent, save for the occasional creak of the old building. And then, it came, a whisper, so soft, so faint, he thought he might have imagined it. But it came again, louder this time, brushing against his ear, just like it had in the fog. His heart skipped a beat. The voice was calling his name. No, it wasn't a hallucination. It was real. Ryan shot up in bed, heart pounding. But when he looked around, the room was empty. He could still hear the whisper, though, like the sound of someone breathing down his neck. He bolted out of bed and ran down the hallway to the common area, but there was no one there. The voices had stopped. For now. But Ryan couldn't shake the sensation of eyes on him. The feeling that something or someone was waiting, watching, and he knew deep down that it wasn't just a trick of the mind. The witch hadn't been stopped. He tried to forget, but the whispering voices became a constant presence in his life. In the quiet of the night, he could hear them. When he walked down the street in the middle of the day, he would sometimes catch the faintest glimpse of something. Shadows, figures just out of sight. He'd turn, and there would be nothing there. And then came the dreams. In his sleep, he saw her, the witch. She stood on the mountain's edge, shrouded in fog, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. And as he watched her, helpless and paralyzed by fear, he knew that he was not alone, that the fog had followed him. She had followed him. It never ended. It never would. Ryan didn't speak about it to anyone, not to his friends, not to his commanding officers, not to his family. But every night, as the winds howled and the fog rolled in, he could hear it again, the whisper of his name. And in the deep silence of the night, as he lay awake, the witch's voice echoed in his mind. You cannot escape. Story 2. As the days wore on, James couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just the whispers that echoed through the trees, the way they seemed to follow him even when there was no one around. It wasn't the unnerving silence that filled the forest at night either. It was the growing sense that the very land around them was alive, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. One evening, while on his usual patrol, James felt it more than ever. His boots crunching through the dry leaves, his breath coming in shallow bursts. He couldn't ignore the sense of being surrounded. The forest had always felt dense, but now it felt like a pressure on his chest, as though the trees themselves were closing in on him. He tried to shake the feeling, telling himself it was just paranoia. But then the laughter came again, a low, guttural chuckle that vibrated through the ground. It wasn't the playful sound of an animal. It wasn't a distant echo of someone having a conversation. It was something darker, a laughter that seemed to reach deep inside him, stirring something primal. His heart began to race, and his fingers twitched near his sidearm, but he didn't draw it. Not yet. He forced himself to continue walking, determined to stay calm, but the laughter grew louder. It surrounded him now, coming from all directions. It was as though the very trees themselves were laughing at him. Stop it, he muttered under his breath, trying to steady his breath. Just stay focused. But the laughter didn't stop. It only grew more frantic, until it was almost a scream, but not quite. A voice distorted by something ancient, something that belonged to the forest itself. It was as if the forest was mocking him, feeding on his fear. He turned in circles, searching the darkness for any movement, but there was nothing there. Nothing he could see, nothing he could touch. Then he felt it, a shift in the air, a heavy presence behind him. The laughter stopped suddenly and an icy cold settled around him. The forest seemed to exhale a long, deep breath, and for a moment, everything went silent again. So silent that James thought his heart had stopped. He turned slowly, his eyes scanning the shadows, every inch of the forest feeling as though it were closing in. And then he saw it. In the distance, through the thick, suffocating fog that had crept in overnight, a shape stood between the trees. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and its limbs were long, far too long for any man. Its body was obscured by the trees, but its head, James could see its head. It was too large for its body, an elongated skull with hollow, dark eyes that seemed to reflect no light. There was no mouth, no nose, just two dark pits where its face should have been. For a long moment, they stared at each other. James couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. The figure didn't make a sound, didn't step forward. It simply stood there, its head tilting slightly to one side as though studying him, appraising him. "What are you?" James whispered, but the words barely escaped his lips. The figure remained still. Then, just as he was about to raise his weapon, the creature took a slow step toward him. The ground beneath it seemed to bend, the very earth warping around its feet. The trees groaned and cracked as if recoiling from its presence. James took a shaky step back, but his feet wouldn't move fast enough. He could feel the air becoming thick, almost suffocating. The longer he stared at the creature, the more his vision blurred. It was as if the shadows themselves were eating away at the light, distorting everything around him. The creature took another step, and that's when James felt it. A wave of overwhelming dread. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was something deeper, something that gnawed at the edges of his mind. His hands trembled, his gun slipping in his grip as he tried to raise it. But before he could, the creature's hollow eyes seemed to pierce him, and he felt a jolt run through his body, like an electric shock that froze him in place. For what felt like an eternity, they stood there, locked in some sort of silent battle. James could feel his pulse pounding in his ears, his heart racing so violently it felt like it might burst from his chest. The creature's eyes, those dark, endless pits, stared into his soul, stripping away any illusion of control. In that moment, he understood. It wasn't just watching him, it was feeding on his fear, drawing strength from it. The ground beneath him trembled as the creature took another step. James could feel something pulling at his insides, a sensation he couldn't explain, like invisible tendrils wrapping around his limbs. His breath came in ragged gasps, his chest tight with panic. And then just as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature vanished. The air around him seemed to relax, the forest slowly returning to its eerie silence. But the weight in his chest remained, the feeling that something had followed him, that it was still there, watching. James spun around, hoping it had just been a hallucination, a product of too many sleepless nights and too much stress. But deep down, he knew the truth. He had seen something that wasn't supposed to exist, something that had been living in that forest for far longer than humanity had been around to remember. The rest of the night passed in a haze of dread. He couldn't tell if the sounds around him were real or just in his head. The laughter came again, now closer than before, echoing through the trees like an old mocking lullaby. But this time, there was something new. A voice, faint but clear, calling his name from the darkness. It wasn't a voice he recognized. It wasn't even human. "James, come closer." The voice was soft, almost coaxing, but there was an edge to it, an unnatural hunger. James couldn't move. He couldn't even blink. It was as though the very air was thick with a strange magnetic pull, forcing him to stay in place, forcing him to listen. "James, it's waiting," the voice whispered, and that's when the ground began to shake. It wasn't just a tremor anymore. It was a violent shaking, a force that rattled his bones and made his head spin. He stumbled backward, clutching his rifle as if it could protect him. The forest around him seemed to distort, the trees bending at impossible angles, the shadows growing long and twisted. And then, as quickly as it had started, everything stopped. Silence. James fell to his knees, gasping for breath. The air was thick with an oppressive weight, the fog swirling around him like tendrils, as though the very forest were alive and waiting to consume him. He stumbled back to the base, his mind racing. But as he crossed the threshold, he turned and glanced over his shoulder. The trees, now dark and silent, seemed to stare back at him. And deep in the shadows, he swore he could see those eyes. The same hollow, black pits. He was not alone. The Watchers were still out there, and they would never let him go. Story 3. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from the fire crackling in the hearth. My grandfather, Antonio Miguel Halima, leaned back in his chair, the weight of his memories evident in his tired eyes. He was 97 years old now, but his mind was sharp as ever. We were gathered around him in his small home, each of us with a cup of hot cocoa, listening intently to his every word. This was a ritual we had grown accustomed to, Every visit, he would tell us stories of his time during World War II. But tonight, there was something different in the air, something darker. As the fire flickered, my cousins and I exchanged curious glances. We had asked him countless times about his experiences, but there was always one story he avoided telling. This time, however, something in his expression made us think he might finally share it. "Grandfather," my cousin Maria asked cautiously, "what's the one memory from the war that you can never forget?" He fell silent for a moment, as if the question had triggered something deep within him. His face grew pale, and for the first time in years, I saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. He looked around the room, almost as if checking for something, someone, lurking in the shadows. "I remember the night of March 27th, 1942, he began, his voice rough and strained. "I was just a boy, barely old enough to fight. I had been stationed in the mountains of Bataan, assigned as an office clerk, but that night everything changed. The air around us seemed to grow heavier as he spoke. The fire crackled, but the warmth it provided felt distant, almost irrelevant compared to the chill settling in the room. We were called to reinforce the troops at Mount Samat. The situation was dire. The Japanese had us surrounded. I remember the fear in the eyes of the soldiers around me, and how we all knew we were walking into a death trap. But there was no choice. We had to climb that mountain, even though we knew we wouldn't make it out alive." His eyes darkened as he continued. "As we climbed, the sky above us was thick with smoke. The air was suffocating. You could hear the bombs dropping, the mortars exploding, the cries of the wounded. It was chaos. But amidst all that noise, there was something else. A sound that didn't belong. A strange laughter. It echoed through the trees, faint and distorted, like it was coming from somewhere beyond the living. I remember thinking it was just the stress of the battle getting to me, but it wasn't. It was real." "Who was laughing?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The question seemed to escape my lips before I could stop it, and I regretted it instantly. Grandfather's gaze shifted to the floor, his hands trembling slightly as he clutched his cup. "I don't know, but I'll tell you this. The laughter wasn't human. It sounded wrong, like something was mocking us, mocking our suffering." Maria shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "But you made it through, right? You survived." His eyes met hers, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something dark, a memory, a fear that he had never spoken of before. "I thought I had survived, but survival, it seems, is not always what we think it is." The room grew even quieter. The fire crackled, but the silence was deafening. My grandfather looked distant now, lost in his thoughts as if the weight of those memories was too much to bear. "It wasn't just the bombs and the enemy soldiers," he continued, his voice soft but firm. "It was the forest itself, the mountain, the watchers." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "What do you mean by watchers?" I asked, leaning forward, my heart racing. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mix of sorrow and fear. "At first we thought they were just other soldiers, moving through the trees, but they weren't. They were something else. Shadows, figures that never came close enough to be fully seen, but you could always feel them, watching us, following us. We would hear their footsteps, but when we turned to look, there was nothing there, just trees and smoke. And that damn laughter." A chill ran down my spine. "What happened to them? The soldiers, I mean." Grandfather shook his head slowly. "Some of them went mad. The stress of the battle, the hunger, the fear, it broke them. They started talking to themselves, laughing, even when no one else was around. Some of them swore they saw the watchers standing just at the edge of the trees, their eyes glowing in the dark. But no one believed them. Not at first, but when the food ran out and the bodies of the fallen piled up, it became harder to deny what was happening." His voice faltered, and for a moment I saw a flicker of something dark and ancient in his eyes. "One night we heard a soldier scream, but when we rushed to help, there was nothing but his body, his face frozen in terror, his eyes, and they were wide open, staring into the forest. And then we heard it again, the laughter. Closer this time. It wasn't just the enemy anymore. It was something else, something that had been there all along." My cousins and I sat in the stunned silence, the weight of his words sinking in. I couldn't bring myself to speak, but I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. "Grandfather, did you ever find out what it was?" Maria finally asked, her voice trembling. He shook his head, his eyes distant. I don't think I ever will. We fought until we couldn't fight anymore. The Japanese eventually took us as prisoners, but the Watchers, they never left. Even in the camps, I could hear that laughter echoing in the distance. I don't know if they were real or if they were something our minds created in the madness of war, but they were always there. He paused, his hands trembling slightly as he set his cup down on the table. When I finally left that place, I thought I had escaped. But the Watchers, they followed me. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can hear them. And sometimes when I look out into the trees at night, I swear I see them, standing there, watching, waiting. The fire crackled, and the room fell into an uneasy silence. My cousins and I exchanged nervous glances, the weight of what we had just heard sinking in. "Grandfather," I whispered, my voice barely audible, "do you think they'll ever stop watching?" He met my gaze, his eyes filled with an unspoken terror. "I don't know," he said quietly, "but I know one thing. When you've seen what I've seen, you'll never truly feel safe again. The war doesn't end when the fighting stops. Some battles, they never end." Story 4. I was stationed at a military base in the United Arab Emirates, close to the Persian Gulf. Our lives there were controlled by routine, but there was something about that place, something about the area surrounding the base, that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The base itself was a quiet place, especially at night, when the waves lapped softly against the shore. But the atmosphere always felt off, a deep, creeping unease that clung to the air like a fog. The base was surrounded by a cluster of old condemned buildings. These were structures that no one ever seemed to talk about, but everyone avoided. The crumbling concrete and rusting metal were a sharp contrast to the shiny modernity of the military operations center. For weeks, I had heard whispers from the other soldiers, mostly talk of strange occurrences. Some claimed they had seen strange figures moving in the dark. Others talked about hearing unsettling sounds late at night, distant cries or the sound of dragging objects. But none of them dared to go near the buildings, and neither did I. That night, I was on duty at the Tactical Operations Center. The usual buzz of activity had died down, and I was left alone with only a few others. My shift had been uneventful, but I needed to stretch my legs. I stepped outside, hoping for a quick break before my next radio check. The air was thick, the heat from the day still clinging to the ground. But the night was still. The distant hum of the desert felt like the world had paused. I made my way to the bathroom trailers, but as I walked past the abandoned buildings, something stopped me, a sound, a cry. At first I brushed it off as nothing. It was faint, distant, maybe just the wind. But then it came again, a scream, sharp and raw, cutting through the silence like a knife. It wasn't a human sound. It had the tortured wail of an animal in pain, mixed with something more. An almost childlike cry that sent a chill down my spine. I froze. I glanced around. The security forces were stationed some distance away, and they were never far from their posts. No one should have been near those buildings, especially at this hour. The structures had been abandoned for years. Still, I stood there for a moment, considering my options. Part of me screamed to turn away, to ignore it, to walk back to the safety of the Tactical Operations Center. But the other part of me, the part that always needed to know, the part that was trained to investigate, urged me forward. I walked cautiously toward the building, my heart beating faster with each step. The sound grew louder, more distinct, more desperate. It was like something or someone was in agony. I hesitated. My gut told me to stop, but my curiosity got the better of me. There was a voice in my head urging me to help, to figure out what was happening. But when I got closer, the sound changed. It was now more than just a cry. There was a dragging noise, something heavy scraping across the concrete floor inside, a sickening noise. The hairs on my neck stood up, and my hands tightened around the handle of my knife. I hadn't brought my rifle, no need for it with nothing to report, but I had my sidearm, and that would have to do. I slowly approached the building, trying to peer through the cracked, shattered windows, but it was dark inside, too dark. It felt unnatural, like the darkness was alive, like it was consuming the light itself. The air turned cold, and I felt a weight on my chest, like the very atmosphere was pressing down on me. Then everything went silent. It was deafening. No sound, no wind, no cries, just an overwhelming silence that seemed to stretch for miles. I stood there, Frozen. My heart raced in my chest. Every muscle in my body screamed for me to turn around and leave, but my feet were rooted to the spot. I felt as if the darkness inside the building was pulling me in. And then I saw them. Two enormous eyes glowing a bright yellow locked onto me from the shadows. They were massive, unnaturally large, and they were staring at me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. There was a presence in the building, something more than just the eyes. A shape, a shadow, a figure that was darker than the night itself, towering within the blackness. It was moving slowly, almost with purpose, like it was waiting for me. A cold chill ran through me, but my instincts took over. I turned and ran. I didn't look back. My heart pounded in my ears as I sprinted toward the Tactical Operations Center. The sound of my boots pounding against the gravel was drowned out by the sound of something else. Something behind me. It was faint at first, but then it grew louder. A scratching sound like claws digging into concrete, dragging something heavy behind it. I pushed myself harder, my breath ragged, my legs burning with exhaustion. The light of the base was still a distance away, but the thought of it kept me going. I couldn't look back, not now. When I finally reached the light, I collapsed against a wall, gasping for air. I didn't know how far I had run, but it felt like a lifetime. My hands shook uncontrollably as I tried to steady myself. My mind raced. I glanced back toward the darkened area behind the condemned building, and that's when I saw it again. The creature. It was standing in the moonlight, about 50 yards away. The same grotesque, misshapen figure, like a cross between a kangaroo and a fox, perched on its hind legs, swaying unnaturally from side to side. Its glowing yellow eyes consumed its entire face, and its posture was odd, like it was caught in some invisible breeze that didn't exist. I could feel its gaze burning into me. It let out a low, almost mocking cry, and then it disappeared into the shadows, as quickly as it had appeared. I couldn't move. My legs were numb, my mind a blur of panic and disbelief. But somehow I managed to make my way back to the Tactical Operations Center. My body felt like it was on autopilot, my mind too shaken to process what had just happened. When I got inside, the gunnery sergeant gave me a curious look. "Mac, you okay?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. I didn't tell him. I couldn't. My mind raced as I tried to come up with an explanation, but there was nothing I could say that would make sense. No one would believe me, and I couldn't risk being sent to Balboa, the psychiatric ward, with less than a year until my end of service. So I kept it to myself. But to this day, I still wake up in the dead of night, drenched in sweat. The image of those glowing yellow eyes burned into my mind. The creature's swaying form, its eerie cry, and the cold, suffocating darkness that clung to the air. Sometimes I hear scratching noises in the distance. I wonder if it's the creature, still lurking out there, waiting for me. Every time I go into the woods now, I carry a rosary in my pack, just in case. I don't know why I do it, but something tells me that creature will find me again someday. And when it does, I will be ready. But the question is, will I ever truly be ready? Story 5. As the night grew darker at Fort Bliss, the eerie stillness of the desert seemed to amplify the mystery that had unfolded above them. The narrator and his buddy, still in their 240 pit, exchanged glances, the weight of the strange event pressing down on them both. They had been stationed here for weeks now, used to the vast, unbroken silence of the desert and the occasional hum of military vehicles. But what they had just witnessed was unlike anything they had ever encountered. "I swear to God, I've never seen anything like that," the narrator muttered, his voice tight with unease. His eyes remained fixed on the horizon, as if expecting the strange craft to reappear at any moment. His buddy, still trying to make sense of it all, nodded. "Same. It moved like no plane I've ever seen. No way it was a helicopter, not at that speed." They both sat in silence for a moment, the oppressive weight of the desert night settling over them. The distant rumblings of thunder from the storm seemed to grow louder, though the sky remained clear. The wind picked up slightly, carrying with it the scent of dust and something else, something faintly metallic. "I can't shake the feeling," the narrator said, breaking the silence. "Like we weren't supposed to see that. Like it knew we were watching." His buddy shifted uneasily. "You think it was one of ours? A secret project or something?" "I don't know," the narrator replied, his voice distant, his mind racing through possibilities. "It didn't feel like anything I've ever heard about. No aircraft moves like that. Just as the tension seemed to reach its peak, a strange sound sliced through the air. It was faint at first, but it grew louder. A low, rumbling hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The narrator's heart skipped a beat, and he turned instinctively toward the source of the noise. His buddy followed his gaze, his eyes wide with alarm. "What the hell is that?" the narrator whispered, his breath catching in his throat. The hum grew louder, then shifted into a deep, resonating vibration that seemed to rattle the very ground beneath them. It was unlike anything they had ever heard. Their guard post, the desert, the storm. It all seemed to fade into the background as the sound took over. The air felt thick, charged with a strange energy. The sky, once clear and bright with stars, now seemed to ripple, the darkness shifting in unnatural ways. Suddenly, the object reappeared in the sky, darting across the stars like a phantom. It moved so quickly, it was as though the very laws of nature were being bent. The narrator could feel his heart pounding in his chest as he watched it twist and turn, each movement more erratic than the last. His mind couldn't process what he was seeing. I don't think this is just a weird plane anymore," his buddy said, his voice barely above a whisper. The narrator's throat tightened. He couldn't speak, couldn't even breathe properly as the object seemed to grow larger, its shape becoming clearer against the dark sky. For a moment it stopped, hovering above them. Then in an instant, it shot forward with such velocity that the narrator could feel the air shift with it. The ground beneath them seemed to tremble, and the very fabric of reality felt like it was being stretched thin. "What the hell is going on?" his buddy gasped, eyes wide, his hand clutching his rifle like it might offer some protection. The narrator didn't answer. He couldn't. His thoughts were a jumble of fear and disbelief. His instincts screamed at him to run, to hide, but his body was frozen, as if something was holding him in place. It wasn't just fear. It was something deeper, something primal, like the very desert itself was watching them. "Get down!" the narrator finally hissed, dragging his buddy down to the ground. They both huddled low, trying to remain out of sight, though they knew it was probably pointless. They couldn't escape this. The object shifted again, its movements sharp and precise. It seemed to be circling them, studying them. The hum in the air grew louder, more intense, and the ground beneath them seemed to vibrate more violently. Then in a split second, the object disappeared, vanishing into the night as quickly as it had come. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The silence that followed was deafening. The hum in the air was gone, replaced by the sound of their ragged breathing and the distant storm. But even that seemed distant, like it was happening in another world entirely. We need to get back," his buddy said, his voice shaking. The narrator nodded, too stunned to speak. They both scrambled to their feet and moved quickly, not daring to look back. The desert around them seemed impossibly quiet, as if holding its breath, waiting for something. They didn't know what it was, but they knew they couldn't stay there, not after what they had just witnessed. As they reached the safety of their tent, the narrator felt his body trembling, his mind racing. What had they seen? What was that thing? And why had it appeared to them, alone in the middle of nowhere? Weeks passed, and the incident became a whispered memory, something they couldn't quite explain. But the narrator couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The sky, the desert, even the air. It all felt different. The strange object, whatever it had been, had left a mark on him, a question that no one could answer. And then, one night, alone in his bunk, the narrator woke with a start. His heart was pounding, his breath coming in short gasps. He felt like he was being watched. His eyes darted around the dimly lit room, but there was nothing there. Still, the feeling lingered, a cold weight in the pit of his stomach. He tried to shake it off, but it wouldn't go away. That thing in the sky, those eyes, it wasn't over. It had only just begun. Story 6. It was just another routine night at Fort Hookah, a place where time seemed to stretch endlessly between dusk and dawn. I had been stationed here for months, but there was something about the night shift that always made the barracks feel colder, more oppressive. As an instructor, my job was to supervise the soldiers in training, ensuring that they were safe and that everything was in order. But tonight, something was different. I had been assigned to oversee Weinstein Village, the barracks closest to battalion headquarters, and it was my turn to cover staff duty. Everything had been quiet up until now. The soldiers either holed up in their rooms or quietly walking to the mess hall for a late-night snack. Nothing out of the ordinary. The halls were quiet, the air thick with the scent of dust and old wood. As I walked down the first hall, I checked the doors and listened for any movement. Nothing. The soldiers were mostly in their rooms, likely resting before the next day's training. I made my way to the other side of the building, feeling the cold floor beneath my boots. The lights overhead flickered once or twice, casting long shadows along the walls. As I walked past one of the rooms, a soldier stepped out into the hallway, dressed only in shorts and flip-flops, his bare chest glistening in the dim light. "Hey, no dude," I called out to him, my voice echoing off the walls. "You need to put on a shirt. It's against regulations." He nodded wordlessly and turned back into his room, and I continued down the hallway, my footsteps the only sound in the otherwise silent barracks. But then something caught my eye. At the end of the hall, there was something or someone standing outside the window. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light or my mind playing tricks on me. But as I focused, I realized something was wrong. A man was standing outside the third-floor window. I froze. The figure was still, motionless, but he was standing so close to the glass that it didn't make sense. There was no ledge, no balcony, no fire escape outside the window. How could someone be standing there, let alone at this height? It was impossible. I stared at him, my heart beginning to beat faster in my chest. The man didn't move, didn't even seem to notice me. He just stood there, his silhouette barely visible against the darkness outside. And then, as if responding to some unseen cue, he started walking. Slowly, deliberately, he moved past the window. But that wasn't possible. The window was on the third floor. There was no way someone could walk along the outside of the building like that. My mind raced, my pulse quickening, as I scrambled to make sense of what I was seeing. My eyes darted across the window, searching for any sign of a rope or climbing equipment that might explain how this was happening. But there was nothing. Nothing at all. Without thinking, I bolted downstairs, grabbing the Maglite flashlight from the desk and running outside. The cool night air hit me, sharp and biting. I scanned the area with the beam of light, hoping to find some explanation, anything that could prove I hadn't imagined it. But the ground was empty. There was nothing. No signs of anyone having climbed up to the window, no footprints in the dirt, nothing that could explain how someone had been standing there. I felt a chill creep up my spine. My mind was racing, but the only thing I could think was that there was no way anyone could have reached that window, let alone walked along it like that. I went back inside, still shaken, my hands trembling. As I walked through the lobby, I crossed paths with the soldier I had seen earlier. He was heading back upstairs, a can of Coke in his hand, looking perfectly normal. "Were you outside swinging that flashlight around?" he asked, his voice casual. I nodded, still on edge. Before I could say anything else, he just shrugged. "Did you see the ghost?" The words hit me like a ton of bricks. I stopped dead in my tracks, my mind struggling to catch up. "The ghost?" He didn't look at me, just kept walking back toward the stairs. "Yeah, the ghost. Happens all the time around here. You'll get used to it." I stood there completely stunned. Ghost? What was he talking about? I had just seen something impossible, something that didn't make sense. And yet here he was, acting like it was no big deal. The rest of the night dragged on in a blur. My thoughts kept racing back to the third-floor window, to the figure I had seen, standing impossibly outside. But no matter how hard I tried to rationalize it, nothing made sense. There was no explanation. I couldn't just forget about it. The next morning, I decided to speak with the staff sergeant in charge of staff duty. I had to know if there was an explanation, something that could put my mind at ease. I recounted the entire story to him, describing the man standing outside the window, the way he had walked past it without any apparent means of support. The sergeant listened quietly, his face unreadable. When I finished, he simply shrugged. "Did you see the ghost?" he asked, almost like he was asking if I had seen the weather report. I froze. What did he mean by that? "The ghost?" "Yeah," the sergeant replied, his voice calm and indifferent. "It's not the first time it's happened. Ghosts around here. You'll get used to it." I was left speechless, the words hanging in the air like an ominous fog. Ghosts? Was that supposed to be some kind of joke? Or was there something more to this than I could understand? For the first time in my military career, I felt a deep, unsettling fear settle into my bones. I had never believed in ghosts, never thought much of the stories soldiers told around the campfire. But now, I wasn't so sure. I couldn't stop thinking about that figure on the third-floor window. The way he had just appeared out of nowhere. The way he had moved without any visible means of support. And then, the soldier's casual mention of the ghost. It didn't add up. Even now, years later, I still think about that night. Every time I pass by Weinstein Village, I can't help but glance up at the windows, wondering if I'll see him again. I know one thing for sure. There's something in that building, something that doesn't belong, and every time I close my eyes, I hear it whispering in the silence, calling me back. Story 7. During my time stationed at Fort Leonard Wood, there was always talk about one barracks, the one everyone avoided. Barracks 12. It had a reputation, one that kept most soldiers from even thinking about setting foot there after dark. Some people said it was a ghost that haunted the halls, but most of us believed it was something much darker. Something ancient. Rumors had been circulating for as long as I could remember, and every now and then, I'd hear soldiers tell stories. Strange things, unexplained sounds, flickering lights, cold spots that would freeze you to your core. I didn't believe in that kind of stuff at first. I thought it was just idle talk, the kind of chatter you get when people are too tired or too bored. But all that changed after one night. It started innocently enough. I had been assigned to Barracks 12 as a duty officer for the night shift. I was walking down the hallway, checking rooms, making sure everything was in order. The place was eerily quiet, almost too quiet. The only sounds were the hum of the fluorescent lights above and the occasional distant thud of boots hitting the floor from the far end of the building. As I rounded the corner, I saw Corporal Jacobson standing outside his room. He wasn't wearing his uniform, just a pair of sweatpants and a t-shirt, looking like he had just come from a workout. "You heading out?" I asked, noticing he wasn't in his usual spot. Jacobson didn't respond immediately. He stared down the hallway, his face pale and drawn. He turned to me, and for a moment, I saw something I couldn't place, flicker in his eyes. "I'm just taking a walk," he muttered, his voice low. "This place, it gets to you." I raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" He glanced around, checking over his shoulder as though someone was watching. Then, he leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "There's something wrong with this place. I don't know what it is, but it's not just your typical ghost story. You'll see. Just wait." At the time, I brushed it off as another one of those late-night ramblings, soldiers trying to scare each other with supernatural tales. But later that night, I started hearing the sounds. Crying, soft at first, barely audible, but growing louder as the night stretched on. It was coming from the bathroom near the end of the hall. The sound of someone sobbing, desperate and guttural, as if in pain. But when I went to check, there was nothing. Just an empty bathroom. The sinks, the stalls, the showers, silent. I shook my head, trying to dismiss it. But the feeling in the air changed. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Around midnight, I was on my rounds again. This time I wasn't just walking, I was listening. The crying had stopped, but in its place was a new sound, a faint scraping, as though something was dragging along the floor. I moved down the hall, following the noise. As I reached the end, I saw it, the door to the abandoned room at the end of the hall. It was slightly ajar. I stopped. My heart skipped a beat. No one had been in that room for years. It was sealed shut, locked, abandoned. But there it was, open, and the dragging sound came from within. Without thinking, I stepped forward, pushed the door all the way open. The room was dark. A thick layer of dust coated the floor, and the air smelled stale, as though it hadn't been touched in years. But it wasn't the room that caught my attention. It was what I saw in the corner, a figure standing motionless in the dark. I froze, my pulse raced, and for a moment, I couldn't move. Then the figure shifted. Slowly, deliberately, it took a step toward me, its movements unnaturally smooth, as if gliding across the floor. I backed up, my foot hitting the door with a loud thud. The figure didn't react. It just stood there watching me. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and empty. A wave of dread washed over me, paralyzing me where I stood. "Who's there?" I managed to say, but the words felt hollow, meaningless. The figure didn't speak. Instead, I heard a voice, faint at first, then growing louder. "Leave. Leave. Leave now." The voice echoed through my mind, filling my head with a terrible, suffocating pressure. I turned and bolted, not caring if anyone saw me. My heart pounded in my chest as I ran down the hallway, past the empty rooms, past the soldiers sleeping soundly in their beds. But even as I reached the staircase, I could still feel it. The presence. Watching. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, Jacobson found me in the mess hall. He didn't look surprised, but there was something different about him now. A kind of grim satisfaction in his eyes, as if he had been expecting this all along. "You saw it, didn't you?" he asked quietly, his voice almost too calm. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. "Just like I said," he murmured, sipping his coffee. "You shouldn't have gone in there. It's not just a ghost. It's something much worse. Something that never leaves." His words hung in the air, heavy and full of meaning. I wanted to ask more, but the fear kept me silent. I couldn't shake the image of that figure in the room, its cold gaze following me, as if it was waiting for something, waiting for me to do something. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I tried to go about my duties, but every time I walked down that hall, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. That night we gathered again. Jacobson had convinced a few of us to confront the thing that haunted Barracks 12. We weren't sure what we were trying to do, but we knew we couldn't leave it alone. We made our way back to the room at the end of the hall, armed with nothing but flashlights and our own nerves. As we stood there, waiting, the temperature began to drop. The air grew thick, heavy, suffocating. And then, out of the shadows, it emerged, the figure from the room. But this time, it wasn't alone. It was surrounded by a swirling mist, black as pitch that seemed to move and shift of its own accord. It moved toward us, its presence suffocating, each step bringing with it an overwhelming sense of dread. We tried to back away, but the mist closed in, trapping us, and then I heard it. The voice, low and insistent. "Leave, leave, before it's too late." I don't know how long we stood there, paralyzed by fear. All I could hear was the voice, over and over, a broken chant. The air grew thicker, the room colder, until it felt like the walls themselves were closing in. Eventually, we fled, running blindly, not daring to look back. We didn't speak as we left Barracks 12 behind us, but I could feel it, something still watching, waiting. And as I lay in my bed that night, I heard it again, the whisper, software faint. "Leave, leave, before it's too late." I don't know what happened that night, or what we encountered in Barracks 12. But I do know one thing. The thing that watches never leaves. And sometimes, I swear, I can still feel it, lurking just outside my door, waiting for the right moment to return. And maybe, just maybe, it's waiting for me. Story 8. I had been in the military for over 8 years before I returned home to Austin, Texas, and settled into civilian life. The transition had been tougher than expected, but it was good to be back. Then came the order. President Bush had decided to send more troops to Iraq in 2003, and just as I was starting to think I could breathe again, I received a summons. My local National Guard unit at Camp M needed me, and I was immediately recalled. It wasn't a choice I had. Orders were orders. The commander told me I wasn't to join the unit. Instead, I'd be sent as part of a contractor team working with Halliburton. The pay was better, the work was grueling, but it was a way to stay close to what I knew best. I arrived in Kuwait, where the air was thick and the night strangely cold, a reminder of the brutal environment we were about to face. I was part of a convoy that ran supplies back and forth between Kuwait and Baghdad. The road was treacherous, lined with danger at every turn. I manned a mounted weapon, accompanying the mostly civilian drivers through territory known for its IEDs and constant sniper fire. The convoy had become a family of sorts, with each of us relying on the other to stay alive. But there were things out here in the desert that no one could explain, things that would turn a routine mission into something far worse. One afternoon, we passed through a place called Camp Babylon, an ancient site near the ruins of what was once thought to be the Tower of Babel. I'd heard rumors about it. Soldiers and contractors whispered about strange occurrences in the area. They said the place was cursed, haunted by the ghosts of the past. But nothing could prepare me for what we would experience that day. As we made our way through the dusty ruins, the convoy was hit with small arms fire. The usual drill kicked in. We stopped, dismounted, and returned fire. It was a standard procedure, Part of the job, but this time, something felt different. The sound of gunfire echoed across the ancient stones, but something else was there. I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, shadows darting between the ruins. They were too quick, too elusive to be human. "Did you see that?" I asked Jason, a contractor who was always talking about the ancient mysticism of Babylon. He was a 32nd degree Mason, into all sorts of occult stuff. He just nodded, not looking at me. "Yeah, I saw it," he muttered. "Shadow people. They've been here for centuries." I shook my head. "Jason, focus. We're not here for your ghost stories." But the shadows didn't go away. We all saw them, moving between the crumbling columns, disappearing as fast as they appeared. It was unsettling, but we had to move forward. The convoy cleared the area, but the unease lingered, hanging in the air like a fog. A month later, the convoy found itself back near Camp Babylon. This time it was darker. The weather had shifted, and a chill had settled over the desert. Our convoy had just completed a supply drop in Baghdad and was on the way back to Camp Doha when disaster struck. A truck broke down. The convoy halted, and we were stuck in the heart of the ruins once again. Night had fallen, and the cold air pressed in on us. As we waited for the mechanics to finish repairs, I took up a guard position near the ruins. Jason was with me, his usual calm demeanor gone. He was scanning the area with his night vision goggles when he suddenly froze. I looked at him, confused. "What's wrong?" He didn't answer immediately. His eyes were wide, his hand trembling on his rifle. "There's something out there," he whispered, but his voice was hoarse, strained. "What do you mean, something?" I asked, my heart picking up its pace. "Is it the enemy?" "No, not exactly. I don't know." He took a step back, his feet dragging in the sand. "There's something in the ruins." I felt a shiver crawl up my spine, but I didn't want to give in to whatever paranoia was clouding my judgment. Then I saw it, a small light floating over the ruins. At first, I thought it was someone with a flashlight, but as I adjusted my goggles, I realized it was something different. A ball of light, glowing faintly, moving slowly towards the ancient stones. "What the hell is that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the wind. Jason's face paled even further, and he muttered something under his breath that I couldn't make out. I raised my weapon, scanning the area. We were silent, listening. When the sound came, it started low, a mournful wail that seemed to emanate from deep within the ruins. It was a woman's voice, long and drawn out, filled with an anguish I couldn't comprehend. It echoed around us, and I could feel the air grow colder, heavier. The light continued to drift towards the ruins, oblivious to us. I reached for my flashlight, but as soon as I turned it on, it felt as though the beam of light wasn't just illuminating the ruins, it was absorbing the darkness around it. It felt unnatural. The wailing was growing louder now, surrounding us, coming from every direction. It was as if the very ruins themselves were alive, mourning something that had been lost long ago. I turned to Jason, but he was staring into the darkness, his face locked in terror. "We need to leave," he finally choked out, his voice barely a whisper. "We can't just leave," I snapped. "We're not done here yet." But something inside me was starting to crack. The wail was relentless, echoing through the ruins. And that light, it wasn't just a light, it was something else, something dark and ancient. I looked back at Jason, but he had already started to back away. "Let's go," he begged. "Now, it's not safe here. Don't you feel it?" I wanted to argue, but I couldn't. I could feel it too. The weight of something watching us, waiting for us to make a mistake. It was too late. The convoy was ready to move. And we made our way back, the unease lingering like a shadow that wouldn't leave. The next morning after the sun had risen, I saw Jason again. He wasn't the same. His eyes were hollow, distant, and when I asked him what he saw in the ruins, he only shook his head, muttering something about the woman in the stone. I didn't understand it then, and I still don't. But I know this. Whatever we encountered in Babylon wasn't just some ghost or phantom. It was something older, something that has been waiting in the shadows of that cursed place for millennia. And it's still there. Watching? Story 9. It was the summer of 2004 when I was summoned back into active duty. After a short break from the Army, I had hoped to settle into a peaceful civilian life in Texas, but that was not to be. The phone rang early one morning, and the voice on the other end was crisp and professional. "Sergeant, we need you back. Your unit has been reassigned." Just like that, I was heading back into a war zone. I had been stationed in Iraq previously, but this time I was called in as a contractor for Halliburton, providing logistical support. The money was good, and with the war still raging, I knew this would be my chance to secure my future. I arrived in Kuwait, and my assignment was straightforward: oversee the convoy of supplies from Camp Doha to Baghdad. The route was filled with danger, constant threat of IEDs, small arms fire, and mechanical breakdowns. What I didn't expect was to encounter something far worse than the usual hazards of the battlefield. One night, as our convoy made its way through the barren desert, we approached an old military base, one that had been abandoned for years. The place was known as Fort Ravenwood, and it had a reputation. No one dared to speak of it openly, but it was said that something dark lingered there, something that made even the bravest soldiers uneasy. I heard the rumors, of course, but I didn't believe in ghost stories. Not until that night. "You heard the stories, right?" Mike, a fellow contractor and former soldier, asked me as we passed by the crumbling fort walls. His tone was serious, though his eyes remained fixed on the road ahead. I chuckled. "Just another abandoned base. There are hundreds of them here in the desert. Ghost stories are all we have to pass the time." But Mike wasn't laughing. "It's not just a ghost. There's something else here. Something that's waiting." I waved him off, but deep down I couldn't shake the feeling that he was right. There was something unsettling about the place. The way the wind howled through the ruined buildings, the silence that enveloped everything, like the world itself had decided to forget this place. As we settled in for the night, the camp was strangely quiet. No chatter, no noise from the usual desert creatures. Just the eerie stillness that seemed to suffocate the air. I tried to distract myself by keeping busy, checking the convoy's equipment, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that we weren't alone. "Do you hear that?" Mike whispered from behind me. I froze. The sound was faint, but unmistakable. A distant wail like a woman in pain carried on the wind. It echoed through the empty streets of the fort, sending a chill down my spine. "It's just the wind," I muttered, though even I wasn't convinced. But then the lights flickered, casting long shadows across the camp. A few of the men looked up, their faces pale, their eyes wide. One of the contractors, Thomas, whispered something under his breath, his voice trembling. "Not the wind. That's not the wind." We all gathered by the fire, too nervous to sleep. The whispers grew louder, filling the air with an oppressive sense of dread. No one spoke, but we all understood. There was something in the fort, something that didn't belong. Around midnight, our commanding officer ordered us to conduct a perimeter check. "We need to secure the area. Check for any threats," he commanded. The team set out, weapons at the ready, moving cautiously through the ruins of Fort Ravenwood. As we stepped deeper into the abandoned buildings, the air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. "Stay close," I whispered to Mike, my voice tight with tension. We moved through the hallways, each step feeling heavier than the last. The walls of the fort were cracked and decaying, covered in ancient graffiti that seemed to warn us away. But we pressed on, drawn toward the source of the wailing sound. And then we saw it. A figure, tall, thin, and black as midnight, loomed in the distance. It stood motionless at the far end of the hallway, its outline barely visible in the dim light. It didn't move, didn't speak, but there was something undeniably wrong about it. The air around it felt thick, suffocating. "Who's there?" I called, trying to steady my voice. But there was no response. The figure simply stood there, watching us. I could feel the unease rising in my chest, my heart pounding as if it was trying to escape my ribcage. Mike's breath came in shallow gasps beside me. "We should leave," he muttered, his voice barely audible. But it was too late. The figure began to move. Slowly it turned its head toward us. And in that moment, I knew we had made a terrible mistake. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, glowed faintly, like coals in a fire, and in them, I saw nothing but endless emptiness. The wail grew louder, rising in pitch, like the anguished cry of a woman who had lost everything. We backed away, our steps quickening, but the figure followed, always a few paces behind. "Go! Go!" I shouted to Mike, my voice desperate. We ran, our boots pounding against the cracked stone floor, but the figure didn't stop. It was like the shadows themselves were alive, chasing us through the maze of abandoned rooms and hallways. We finally reached the exit, breathless. But when we looked back, the figure was gone. "Did you see that?" Mike gasped, his face pale as chalk. I nodded, my own chest tightening. "Yeah, but I don't think we were meant to see it." We stumbled back to the camp, where the morning sun was just beginning to rise. The eerie silence had lifted, and the haunting wail was gone. But the terror lingered in our minds. We never spoke of what happened, not even after we returned to Camp Doha. But the memories remained, gnawing at us, tormenting us. The figure, the wail, the suffocating darkness that seemed to follow us. The strange thing was, no one else seemed to notice anything unusual. The camp resumed its usual operations, and the men went about their business as if nothing had happened. But Mike and I knew the truth. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, waiting, watching. The shadow of Fort Ravenwood had followed us back to the base, and no matter where we went, it would never let us go.